Hey everyone, lifelong learner Blueroot here with a step-by-step video on how to set up a simple point-to-site VPN connection in Azure with Radius Authentication. This will allow you to create a secure connection to your virtual network from an individual client computer anywhere in the world, as long as you have an internet connection. In this video, we will be setting up a virtual network with an address space of 10.10.0.0/16 that will contain 3 subnets and 2 virtual machines. One subnet will be the front-end subnet, 10.10.5.0/24, where the Radius server will sit. Another subnet will be the back-end subnet, 10.10.10.0/24, where an internal host will sit. This host is unreachable by any external party. The third and final subnet in our VNet will be the gateway subnet, 10.10.20.0/24. In the Radius server's local domain, we will allow specific users, part of the group called VPN, to access our virtual network through the virtual network gateway. We will implement a network policy on the Radius server to allow these connections and properly authenticate the appropriate users. After everything is set up, I will demonstrate this point-to-site connection from an external host, my personal computer, and VPN into our virtual network to RDP into the internal host. I wouldn't be able to RDP into the internal host unless I was connected to the virtual network. Here I have a fresh free trial subscription from Microsoft. First things first, let's create our resource group to contain all of our relevant Azure resources. I'm just going to call mine Azure VPN for simplicity's sake. When choosing your region, make sure to choose the region physically closest to you or your client. Go ahead and click Review and Create. Next, let's create our virtual network. Make sure to add it to the resource group you just created. Again, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to name mine Azure VPN VNet. Next, hop over to the IP addresses tab. I'm going to change my address space to what was designated in my personal project scope, but of course you can choose whatever you like. Next, I'm going to get rid of the default subnet and create 2 out of the 3 subnets I have in my project scope. First, the front-end subnet, 10.10.5.0/24. And second, the backend subnet, 10.10.10.0/24. I'm purposely leaving out the gateway subnet for now, but you can add it in if you like. It won't make much of a difference. I'm going to make sure everything is disabled under the security tab, and go ahead and click Review and Create. This should only take a few seconds. Okay, now that we have our VNet deployed with our front end and back end subnets, let's deploy our 2 virtual machines. First, we'll deploy our Radius server. Make sure it's in the appropriate resource group. I'm going to name my machine Radius Server for simplicity's sake again. And select the Windows Server 2012 image, because this image has everything I need and more for this point-to-site VPN connection with Radius Authentication. I'm going to choose the smallest recommended size for obvious reasons. For the admin account on this machine, choose any username and password you like. Just make sure you have these creds securely stored somewhere. I'm going to leave port 3389 open for inbound connections so I can RDP into this machine and configure the network policy and Radius server. Disks, I'll leave it as is. Under networking, make sure it's part of your VNet and make sure to place it into the appropriate subnet. The Radius server is in the front end subnet, for my personal scope at least. I'm going to leave public inbound ports on for 3389 so I can RDP into this machine as mentioned before. I'm not going to touch the management and advanced tabs and just click review and create. This should only take a minute or two. Now let's deploy the internal host. All of the settings here will be fairly similar, but of course I'll be creating this for the internal host. I'll just be using a Windows 10 image, and of course choosing the cheapest size. Again, these credentials, secure them, store them safely, and make sure you just don't forget them. I will not be allowing any inbound port rules for this internal machine. And of course, go ahead and click that licensing checkbox. Disks I will not be touching. Under the networking tab, make sure it's part of the appropriate virtual network and the appropriate subnet as well. Of course, my internal host is part of my backend subnet. Again, no public inbound ports. Management and advanced tab I will not be touching. So go ahead and click review and create. Next, let's create our virtual network gateway. Okay, go ahead and name your VNet gateway. And select VPN as the gateway type, and make sure that you have your VPN type as route-based. I'm going to select VPN GW1 as my SKU. If you want more information on the SKUs, I'll share a link from Microsoft in the description of this video to give you a solid explanation. When you choose your virtual network, the resource group will auto-populate. You could leave the gateway subnet address range, but I'm going to change mine to the gateway subnet I have in my personal scope, which was 10.10.20.0/24. Okay, go ahead and create a new public IP address and give it a name. and go ahead and review and create. Uh, just a heads up, the virtual network gateway will take a few minutes to deploy, potentially up to 45 minutes or an hour. It shouldn't take that long though. Okay, while the virtual network gateway is deploying, let's RDP into our Radius server and apply the appropriate configurations. Go ahead and grab the public IP address of the machine and RDP with the port you designated. Here, my public IP address for this machine is 20.43.3.229, and I designated 3389 as the RDP port. I already logged in once, so my username was here. Go ahead and add your own username and password. Accept the certification. Sorry, accept the security certificate. And when you boot up your machine and eventually log in for the first time, Server Manager and its dashboard should automatically load. Under Tools at the top right, we're going to click Computer Management. Under Local Users and Groups, we're going to select Group and create a new group. I'm going to create a group called VPN. There it is. Next, create a user that will be added to this group. You can leave these out. Just give it a simple password, or do as you please, really. I'm going to uncheck this box, and I'm going to make sure the password never expires. Again, this is not standard security policy, but of course this is just for demonstration purposes. Okay. Now I'm going to add this newly created user into the group I just created. The users in this group will be granted VPN access through the network policy that we'll be creating next. Now, under Manage, click Add Roles and Features. Click Next. Ensure role-based or feature-based installation is clicked. Click Next. Make sure your server is selected and click Next. Under Roles, scroll down and select Network Policy and Access Services. Make sure to click Add Features. Click Next. Next. Next again. One more time. And I like clicking this button here just in case if a restart is necessary, it'll go ahead and take care of that itself. Now click Install to install the network policy and access service tools. This should only take a minute or two. Okay, now that the necessary tools are installed on our server, let's go ahead and click Tools again and click Network Policy Server. First, we're going to create a new policy to allow remote network access for the users in our newly created group, VPN. So under Policies on the left, we'll create a new network policy. Give your policy a name. And under Type of Network Access Server, ensure to click Remote Access Server VPN Dial-Up. Under the conditions, click Add. click user groups, and then add the group you created. Okay, next. Make sure you click access granted for obvious reasons. And for authentication methods, I recommend unclicking these less secure options and add the most secure option there is, this one right here. For the next two pages here, I'm just going to leave them as default settings, as these are recommended settings. And after a careful review of what you're configuring, go ahead and click Finish. Now confirm that your new policy is created and that it has the highest processing order in your network policy list. Perfect. Next we will be configuring a new Radius client. So on the left here, under Radius clients, create a new one. Friendly name, I'll give it the friendliest name. And under address, what you're going to want to do here is enter the subnet of your VNet gateway. So my VNet gateway subnet was 10.10.20.0/24. Resolve it and make sure it's entered correctly here. And under the shared secret, I'm just going to click something simple. Choose something simple, and make sure to remember this as when you configure the rest of the virtual network gateway back in Azure, you're going to need to implement this shared secret as well. So I'm going to choose one of the most secure passwords ever. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now back in your Azure portal, your virtual network gateway should be successfully deployed by now. Before we configure the point-to-site connection in the VNet gateway, let's grab the private IP address of your Radius server because we're going to need it. Mine is 10.10.5.4. Now let's go to the VNet gateway. On the left side here, go to point-to-site configuration and configure now. The address pool here is going to be the addresses that VPN connections will be assigned. Make sure this is completely different from anything related to your virtual network. I'll just put 172.68.1.0/24. Now, depending on what machine you'll be installing the VPN on, the tunneling type matters. Since I'll be using a Windows machine, I'll be downloading the Secure Socket Tunneling Protocol, SSTP. Mac users would typically download IKE v2. Click Radius Authentication and enter the server's internal IP address along with the super secret key that you created earlier when configuring your Radius client back on the server. Whoops, you're not supposed to see that. And make sure to click Save. This should only take a few seconds. Okay, so before we download the VPN client and test out the VPN connection, let's double check and confirm a few things. So the internal host public IP address is 52.139.36.38. And if I try to RDP into this as I did with the Radius server, it won't work and I'll be greeted with an error. Of course, trying the private IP address won't work either, for obvious reasons. And there's the error. Now on the Radius server, I should be able to RDP into the internal host since this connection is not coming from a public IP address, but rather another machine in the virtual network. So this is allowed. Since it's in the same VNet, the same private VNet, I will attempt to RDP using the internal host's private IP address, which was 10.10.10.4. Accept the security certificate. And there you have it. So it's confirmed that we can access the internal host from the Radius server. Of course, because of the fact that they're in the same private VNet. Okay, so now let's download the VPN client and test it out. Head over to your VNet gateway, point to site configuration, and download the VPN client. I have mine downloaded already, and after you download the VPN client, extract the zip file to a designated folder and open it up. If you're using a Windows machine like me, open up Windows AMD 64 and run this exe file. Click yes. Just give it a quick second. Now open up your network and internet settings. On the left, click VPN. And you should see a new VPN client for your private Azure VNet available to connect to. Go ahead and connect with the user you created on your Radius server. So mine was blue. And go ahead and connect. And there you go. I'm connected to the VNet through the gateway and authenticated via Radius. Now that I'm connected to the VPN, I should be able to RDP into the internal host using its private IP address, since I'm on the private virtual network now. This is allowed. So the internal host was 10.10.10.4. Let's go ahead and connect. Notice how I'm even now getting prompted for the credentials before I never even was able to even put in credentials to try. Accept the security certificate. And there you go. I'm into the internal host after successfully connecting to the VPN. And that concludes my video on how to set up a simple point-to-site VPN connection in Azure with Radius Authentication. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching my video. If you enjoyed this video or if it helped you out even in the slightest, I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like the video or even share it. I do plan on making more educational videos revolving around IT topics, and this video was the first in my Azure playlist. If you feel like you could benefit from my videos, please feel free to subscribe. Thanks again, and take care.